Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. I thought I'd do a quick review of a movie I recently watched called The Colour Out of Space. If anyone follows me on my gaming channel, they might have seen that I was playing the game Call of Cthulhu. I kind of gave up on it. I probably will return to it at some point, but the thing that made me stop playing it was that I started to reread Lovecraft, and it kind of made me realise how un-Lovecraftian the game was. I think this is a problem that plagues a lot of Lovecraft adaptations, whether it's movies or video games. You can insert as much Lovecraftian lore as you want, but in my opinion this doesn't make it a Lovecraftian horror. I think there's something in Lovecraft's writing that is extremely hard to get across in a visual medium. I think maybe that's why it's so hard for people to adapt his works. There's something unseeable or unexplainable in his writings, which is very hard to convey when you're showing the thing visually on screen. So when I started hearing reviews of The Colour Out of Space, I got pretty excited. People were saying it was one of the most faithful adaptations, it was finally Lovecraft done right, and so I was quite excited to see it. It also stars Nicolas Cage, who is kind of a love him or hate him kind of actor, but I've got to say I do quite enjoy his films, including The Wicker Man. So I thought I would give it a go and see what the fuss was all about. Is it as faithful as people say? So I've got to say, the first impression of this film and the most striking thing about it is the visuals. Every scene is just absolutely stunning to look at. It's a film about colour, as the title might imply, but they've just really gone to town on the colour aspect of this story. It's a film that tells its story with colour, I think. It seems like the colour is the most important thing on the screen at all times. Everything looks like they've boosted up the saturation to maximum, not in a way that looks wholly unnatural, it just gives everything this like gorgeous lush look to it, and it's quite an interesting choice for a horror adaptation, especially with Lovecraft. I know whenever I read his stories, in my head they're always very dark, gloomy type of stories, and that's the kind of imagery I have in my head. And generally horror films are not all that colourful. The colours in it remind me almost of the original Suspiria movie, these sort of bright clashing colours that flash in and out on screen. There's something really important about the colour coding in the movie, and I'd love to see someone go through it scene by scene and decode every use of colour in the film, because as well as the alien colour, there's just so much more going on. I've noticed that almost every indoor scene they seem to be using blue and this orangey brown colour contrasted against each other, and then on the outdoor scenes you've got these greens and purples contrasting, and then each character seems to have their own colour coding. For example, the mother character always seems to be wearing some sort of white outfit. The daughter's always wearing black. The ward character, who plays the narrator in the original story, he always seems to be wearing blue. Nicolas Cage is often seen wearing this red check colour, which I think might be a reference to the original story. There is a certain fate that meets his equivalent character in the story, and towards the end the red checked cloth plays some sort of role, so it's probably just a nod towards the original story. But yeah, I think there's something really important with the colour, even more than the obvious, and like I said, I'd love to see someone do an analysis of the colour in this movie and exactly what the meaning of each colour is. Even without deciphering everything going on, it's just beautiful to look at. It almost all takes place in the middle of this forest. It's the family who live deep within this woodland, and so every background is just this sea of green. At the beginning of the movie, everything just starts out just beautiful green in the background, and then you get these sort of traces of purple weaved through things. The idea of like a purple spiral. It always seems to represent something unnatural. For example, the purple unnatural hair dye in Lavinia's hair, sort of spiraling through her hair, and then when they go to Tommy Chong's character, they go towards his house, and he's got these ribbons wrapped around the trees in spiral shapes in the same purple colour. It seems to sort of try and get this idea in your head from the start that this purple magenta colour is a kind of unnatural source among the greenery and natural colours of the woodland, and kind of an obvious signal, but it's a nice little bit of foreshadowing. So basically the basic plot of the story, and I'm going to try not to give too many strong spoilers here, but there will be some mild ones. A meteorite lands in Nicolas Cage's front garden, And then within the meteorite is the colour from outer space. And I think when Lovecraft was originally writing the story, he wanted to convey an alien presence that was so incomprehensible to human minds that the only way they had to describe it was of being a colour. So in the original story, he describes it as a colour which they've never seen before. It's like an unimaginable colour. It's something that doesn't exist in our human world. It's a colour that shouldn't exist in nature. Obviously, you can't just invent a new colour, so they've used this like magenta colour. But I was actually looking on IMDb, and they've got some interesting trivia about the use of the colour. They use magenta because it's a colour that doesn't exist from a single wavelength of light as part of the colour spectrum of visible light. I don't really understand what that means, to be honest. It's an extra spectral colour that is only perceived by humans in a specific interaction of the optical rods. So anyway, there's an interesting explanation of why they use magenta, but obviously it's a decent replacement for the indescribable colour of the original story, and it looks absolutely stunning on screen. You've got this kind of idea of this magenta colour slowly starting to invade the lush greenery of their surroundings, and first it starts out, the little flowers start sprouting, and then you see like the tendrils wrapping around the trees, mirroring the colouring in the daughter's hair and the ribbons in the trees. You just get this really interesting sense. This is where they sort of capture the Lovecraftian element the best, is this slowly creeping into their lives, this magenta colour slowly infecting the world around them, and as it begins to infect the world around them, it starts to affect their mental state. And it's done really effectively, I would say, for the first 2/3 of the movie, this sort of slow creeping in of this colour, this alien colour, and beautiful at the beginning of the movie. And also there's a lot of things where they use colour to signal danger, like where she cracks the egg and there's blood in the egg, and the lizards with the bright colours on them to indicate that they might be poisonous or dangerous. Always using these colours to signal some kind of present danger or illness or something that is out of place or unnatural. It's also really obvious that they are absolutely passionate about Lovecraft. There's so many little references in there, and probably loads that completely went over my head. I'm not like a huge Lovecraft fan, but there's all these like references to things within the Lovecraft universe, and also how it would be in a modern world. So I really like the daughter has the cheap paperback Necronomicon that she's reading, and it is the kind of thing that if this book existed in the real world, this is kind of the format that you would expect to get it in the modern world. Beautiful film. I really love the atmosphere at the beginning of this creeping, invading. It feels really menacing, and you don't really know what's going on, and the way it's starting to affect the mentality of the family. I think towards the end it starts to fall apart slightly though. It gets to a point where it starts to get a bit too crazy. In the original story, the way the colour outer space ultimately affects people and how it affects like the livestock is it kind of starts to make them disintegrate. It kind of starts to change things in really subtle ways. Like they describe how they keep finding animals and they can't really tell what's wrong with them, but they find it's like a woodchuck or something like that, and it's been transformed in some way. They can't really tell how. It just looks unnatural to them, and they see like a hare leaping across the road or a rabbit, and its stride is a bit too long to be normal. It's just something, when they see it, they can't describe it. It's just something unnatural and uncanny about the creatures, the way they've been mutated. The movie doesn't go that subtle, let me just say. Without getting any spoilers, it's very unsubtle in its conveying of the horror. This is sort of some of the parts that I don't like that much about the film. It starts to take on a bit of like a body horror vibe, which would be fine, and it's fine for them to stray a bit from the source material, but they rely way too much on computer-generated effects to achieve these body horror scenes. And as good as it is, I'm not being down on the people who did these CG effects. It just never looks right. You can always just tell it's not really there. Even if they had a slightly cheaper looking practical effect, I just think it would look so much better. It would look so much more realistic, and it's a shame they didn't go with that. I think it starts to slightly fall apart at that point for me, the movie. So I'm going to go over some of the things I didn't like in the film. The characters are all kind of a bit stereotypical. You've got Nicolas Cage playing Nicolas Cage. You've got Tommy Chong playing Tommy Chong. You've got the stoner teenager brother. You've got the wife who's dying of cancer, and you've got the small child who basically acts as the creepy kid, similar to the one in Poltergeist, who goes, "They're here," basically plays that role. And then you've got the wisecracking, snarky teenager. This role seems to be in every movie these days. I don't know why they always have to insert this sort of character. It's basically the snarky teenage girl character who always has a one-liner for every scene. I call it the Liv Hewson character. Yeah, they did this with the It movies. They always had to have like witty one-liners whenever something scary happens, and it kind of ended up sort of reducing the horror factor of a lot of scenes. And although it's not too bad in this movie, there is a bit of that. There's a bit of a lol random comedy. I don't know what the obsession with alpacas is. They always have alpacas in there because it's, I don't know if it's some reference that goes over my head, but it's a bit sort of, oh, look at us, how random we are, we've got alpacas. I don't know. It's good to have a bit of light relief, but I don't know if in this film sometimes it felt a bit out of place. So yeah, I was saying about the characters in the film, I didn't like them too much because they all felt a bit typical. You can tell with this movie they're trying to do something very different with a horror movie, and a lot of the characters felt very tropey, if you know what I mean. They felt very like you'd seen them in every other horror movie, and I kind of wish they'd done something slightly different with the characters as well as the movie itself. The final act of the movie, it all feels a bit muddled. The problem is the beginning of the film builds up so well, this horror, and it all sort of ends in a crescendo, and it all feels a bit sort of, they're just throwing a load of things at you, a load of elements. And whereas I think if they went a bit more slow paced and subtle with the horrors, it would be more effective. For example, I think there's some genuinely creepy moments. For example, when there's something that happens to the mother and the younger son. When it first reveals what happened to them, it's pretty horrific. You feel like, oh my god, that's horrible, and the reactions of the family are really good, and you kind of feel that horror along with them. And then they just kind of, they don't do much else with it. They don't explore the horror of that situation enough. And I think they could have explored this idea a little bit more. What they do with the mother and the younger son is pretty horrific, and I think they could have sort of explored the family's reaction to that a little bit more than they do, like just go a little bit further with it. And there's another really good moment where they go back to Tommy Chong's house, and there's just this sound from outside. Just the sound design at this moment in the film is really good. It has a really sinister effect. I think it shows real moments of horror, but it's kind of interspersed at this point with a lot of very noisy scenes, a lot of very bright flashing colours that are slightly disorientating, and I think it kind of takes away from the horror in certain scenes. It gets a bit over the top. I'm not being too down on the movie, I just think towards the end it could have been toned down a little bit. I understand what they're doing with the colours, but it gets so bright and psychedelic that it actually becomes quite difficult to watch. It's like I was getting a headache at some point. I remember there was a scene where there was like a blue flashing light from a police car, and it was interspersed with this bright magenta colour, and it was flashing across people's faces, and it was just like I was getting a headache from watching it. It was so disorientating, and you know, it's interesting visually, but it's not horrific. It's not a scary scene. I kind of like that they tried to do something slightly different with what the colour does to people and what it does to the animals. But I think if they were going to go with CG effects, I think if they stuck with what it says in the book, it would have been more interesting. Like in the book, everything sort of turns grey and starts to like disintegrate as if it's sort of turned into ash. And I think they could have done that quite well with computer generated effects. But I think what they went with, it all looked a bit cartoony, a bit slightly silly. A lot of the CG kind of took me out of the atmosphere of the movie at that point. But there were things that they changed from the original story that I actually liked. I think in the Lovecraft's original short story, in the final scene, he introduced like a whole bunch of characters that haven't been introduced in the rest of the story. Like the big climax of the story involves a bunch of people that you don't, apart from the narrator, you don't really know any of the other characters. I think they do a better job. It sort of combines two different parts of the original story to make the end of the movie, which they do that, I think, in a better way. All in all, I enjoyed the movie. I don't want to sound like I'm being down on it. I'm trying to list the things that I didn't like, but I really like that there's a modern horror movie that they've tried to do something different with. I see so many trailers for horror movies coming out, and it just looks like every other horror movie I've seen for the last 10 years or so. You can tell immediately, like beat for beat, everything that's going to happen in that movie. just from watching a trailer, and it's just refreshing to see him finally do something a bit different. The visuals and everything with the movie, it's completely unique. The only thing I can compare it to really is Annihilation. And I think Annihilation is quite inspired by The Colour Out of Space. I think maybe Annihilation does an even better job of being Lovecraftian than The Colour Out of Space does. Annihilation kind of, to me, is like a mashup of Lovecraft and J.G. Ballard's The Crystalline World. It's kind of like those two books combined almost. I felt like some points this film was trying to emulate Annihilation, but not quite doing a good enough job of it. But as I say, all in all, great different horror movie. And interesting enough to elevate it above just the slew of rubbish that comes out these days. I've really got to give the filmmakers kudos for trying something different and being brave enough in it. Yeah, like I say, the first 2/3 of the movie I loved. The last third of the movie I didn't like as much, but I didn't hate it. It wasn't boring, it was just kind of lost its pacing a little bit. It kind of went a bit too much over the top for me. I say go watch it, it's interesting at least. Is it the best Lovecraft adaptation? I don't know, I haven't seen them all. Has it captured the feeling of a Lovecraft movie? Possibly, yes. It's got the sort of weird, unexplained. Even towards the end of it, you don't quite know what the horror is. It leaves enough questions in your mind. This is what I like about Lovecraft, is he'll describe things in detail, but he'll leave enough out for your mind to sort of turn it over. I'll give you an example. The Mountains of Madness, I'm rereading it, and the way they describe the city in the book, they give such a detailed account of the structures of the buildings. When they enter this forgotten city, they give such a detailed account of all the structures of the buildings, how they're built, what material they're made of, all the rock. You could probably just draw a picture, an accurate map of the city just from the description. But there's enough in the descriptions to know that there's something unnatural about it that the narrator can't describe. And although you build up in your mind this accurate image of the city, it leaves something out because the narrator can't quite tell you what it is. It's just something unnatural and evil about it, and it kind of causes you to turn this image of the city around in your head and ponder on it. And that's kind of, I think, where the horror is. It's the indescribable, and I think this movie does a good job of conveying that sort of unknowable horror. It does a good job of capturing that essence of the weird cosmic horror that you can't quite place in your mind. It doesn't quite make sense to a human brain. And I think people who read Lovecraft will all have their own opinion on what makes a Lovecraftian horror, but for me it does a fairly good job, and I would recommend it. And I've heard they're making like 2 more in the same series, so I'll be excited to see them. I'll definitely be watching them when they come out. If you've seen it, let me know what you think as well. I'll be interested to know if other people enjoyed it or not. Oh, and I wanted to say as well, something else. You'll notice more and more as you rewatch it. There seems to be a lot of symbolism and images in there which you might not spot on the first time round, or you might not make the connections. For example, at the beginning of the film, when Lavinia is doing that weird ritual, you see these doll legs hung up in a tree in a kind of swastika pattern, and then later on, which I didn't spot at first, as they're going towards Tommy Chong's house, you see a doll hung up in a tree there, and it kind of, I didn't make the connection at first, but then I think, well, I wonder if there's some connection between Tommy Chong's, his character's called Ezra, between Ezra and Lavinia that isn't quite explained in the movie, but maybe rewatching it you'll see more links between these different characters. It seems like the kind of movie where there's going to be a lot of these like little weird symbols and Easter eggs and things to spot, and I think rewatching it you'll get more out of it. So yeah, that was another thing I think might be important. Is probably a movie that requires a few viewings to appreciate fully.